My name is Vanessa, and I'm going to be walking through the theme of exile in the Old Testament. So this is actually probably one of the biggest themes in the Bible, but one that is pretty commonly overlooked. And so I just kind of want to start with this question asking, have you ever felt this sense of exile, just like you're truly not at home? And to be more specific, exile is being forced to leave your own home, living in a foreign land where just everything is disoriented and you're on your own. And so I'm going to be covering the general theme of exile, more so than the specific word, though I will trace that. So starting, of course, in the Torah, the first place that we most obviously see it is in Genesis with Adam and Eve, when they're living in the garden on the one condition that they don't eat from the tree of good and evil. So not following this condition equals banishment from the garden, and we see that in Genesis 3:24 when they don't obey, and so God banishes them from the garden. So then we go further into chapter 4, and we see this where Cain murders his brother, and because of this, he is also sent away from the presence of God, and this is in 4:16, and he settles in the land of Nod to the east of Eden. And so then in chapter 11, we also see this theme of exile when these people come together in one language to build Babylon, and then they are scattered from there and exiled from Babylon. And we see this in Genesis 11:9. It says, "And from there the Lord dispersed them from all over the face of the earth." And this is where the family of Abraham kind of gets traced out from this exile. And so Genesis 3-11 is retelling the story of all humanity as in exile from Babylon, or that leads to Babylon. So this sets the stage for Abram coming in, and he came in from this ancient region of Babylon. So Israel's origins really come from a wandering, migrating family, again emphasizing that these people don't have a home. And so then in Exodus, we see generations later, Abraham's descendants they're now in Egypt and they're in slavery. And in 1:7-12, we see this great oppression and the state of exile that they are in. And so then Moses comes in and brings them out into exile again. And so they're on their way back to the land of their ancestors. And at Mount Sinai, they build this tabernacle and they're given a divine command. This goes back to the divine command in the Garden of Eden. Trust me, take care of this place, and you'll get to stay here. So this divine command that they are given warns what will happen if they break it. This is the Mosaic covenant. This will allow for them to stay in the promised land. And this is Exodus 19-24. So then we go into Leviticus 26, and this is a section of, blessings and cursings if they follow the law. And so Leviticus 26 warns what will happen when Israel breaks this divine command. If you don't listen to me, and if you don't follow these commands, and you detest my Torah, then here's what I will do. I will scatter you into exile. And this is a continuing developing theme that we see of exile. So then in Numbers, we see this act where they are so close to the promised land, they send in spies, they come back, they don't think they can do it. And so out of this lack of trust, God says that the number of the days that the spies were in the land is the number of days that they're going to wander in exile. And this becomes kind of an exile from the promised land. It's this pre-exile exile. And so then in Deuteronomy, we now immediately make this connection to look to the exile that we see with Israel coming out of Egypt. So just like Adam and Eve, they were given this beautiful promised land, and they would multiply and flourish in it on the one condition that they keep the Mosaic covenant with God. But in Deuteronomy 4, it says, "After you and your grandchildren have lived in the land a long time, and you become corrupt and you make idols and do evil, then you will quickly perish from the land, and the Lord will scatter you among the peoples." The promised land becomes the new Eden, and exile is predicted. So now as we walk into the prophets, in the former prophets, we see this vicious cycle of sin where Israel, they sin, they cry out, they're redeemed, but then they just go right back into this vicious cycle of sin, and it just doesn't get better. And because of that, the prophets warn that exile is going to happen. It's going to come, but nobody's going to listen. And so in Joshua, we see Israel crosses the promised land with Joshua as their leader. They battle the Canaanites, and Joshua divides up the land. And then Joshua ends with his final words to Israel, and he reminds them of God's generosity and calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods. And that if they do, it will equal life and blessing, but then this important theme of exile, if they don't, they're going to be exiled. And so he leaves them with a choice. And so then in 2 Kings 17, we see that Assyria comes in and they just decimate the northern kingdom and take out Samaria, and this is in 722 BC. So the author stops here and gives a prophetic reflection of why this happened here in 2 Kings 17, 7-9. I'll just read parts of it. It says, "And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. They had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations. And so the reason for exile was because of this constant sin against God. So then in Isaiah 39, we see Hezekiah hosts this delegation, and he brings in people from Babylon, and he tries to make these political alliances. And so Isaiah comes in and he confronts him, and he predicts that Babylon is going to turn against him, and he's going to conquer Jerusalem, and they will conquer Jerusalem. And we obviously know that Isaiah is right 100 years later as this comes to pass, as Babylon comes, conquers Jerusalem, and just carries them all out into exile. And so in Jeremiah 25, Israel hasn't come back to God despite Jeremiah's continual warnings. So in the first year of Babylon's new king Nebuchadnezzar, God tells Jeremiah to announce that Babylon is coming to take Israel into exile for 70 years. And this is in verses 8 through 9. So later in chapter 26, though, there's this message of hope that Jeremiah gives to encourage them to flourish in exile, to build homes, to have families, and seek the welfare of the city, and not to listen to these false prophets. So he foretells the hope also that they're not going to be in exile forever, and God's plan for them is to live in exile well and to flourish in the midst of this. And so then in Jeremiah 25, again, this is taken from 2 Kings 25, what we just read. So this is Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem. They come in, they take the rest of Babylon, and they just destroy the temple. And so then in Ezekiel, this gives us a window into the people living in refugee camps. So this is a really key point in the theme of exile. So in Ezekiel 8 to 11, he has another vision of a temple. And this is a temple in his absence, and he sees that it's just being decimated, and people are worshiping other gods and other idols. And in the end, God's presence is leaving the temple. And in this, we also know that through, it's in chapter 11, 22 to 25, that God hasn't abandoned his people. Rather, he's gone into exile with them, and that's where his spirit is going. And he's leaving the temple that has just been defiled. But he promises that a remnant will return with new and transformed hearts. And so then in Ezekiel 37, this is a very powerful image of the reality of exile being death. And this is pictured in just this valley of dry bones. And then out of these dry bones, he also depicts this return from Israel's resurrection. So exile is these dead bones. We are in this state of death. But then when we are coming out of it, it'll be like resurrection, and God is going to breathe new life into us. Exile is death, but God will bring new life and restore us from exile. And so now we're going to go into the writings. And so I just want to track back a little bit. The section of the Torah with exile, it was almost this preparing Israel for this reality of going into the promised land and the reality of exile and their wandering. And so they're getting pumped up, they're prepared, they're giving speeches from Moses, and now we're in the prophets. And the prophets, you're hoping for it to be good, but it just isn't. They do not execute, and it's just this vicious cycle of sin that we talked about. And they're in exile, and this is their reality just over and over again. They are in exile. And so as we come into the writings, it really gives insight and wisdom and how to live life well within this state of exile and what it looks like. And so Psalms, we obviously have a lot of Psalms that speak to this state of exile. And David comes on the scene to remind exiles that he's also been in this state of exile, and he encourages them to have this similar faith. And so we see this in book 5 of the Psalms. Here where these people find themselves in exile. And this is showing how they can praise God in the midst of this. And we see this in Psalms 108 to 110, where David leads the people to reflect on what it means to be delivered from the exile. And then in Psalms 137, he tells the exiles to sing God praises when they are in a foreign land in the midst of exile. And then in Psalms 138 to 145, David teaches the people how to pray in exile. And so we continuously hear these phrases of, God, my rock, my fortress, my soul thirsts for you. I long for you. You are my refuge. Give ear. And so then we're going to transfer into Lamentations. And I love Lamentations because it's a beautiful picture of how to suffer well in exile. And it's a memorial to the pain and confusion that the Israelites are in following just this decimation of Jerusalem and the temple. And so this book provides a very detailed image of their life looking onto this. And so God's people are venting their anger over this exile and this ruin. And we see this in verses chapter 1, verses 7 to 8. It says, when her people fell into the enemy's hands, there was no one to help her. Jerusalem had sinned greatly. They're unclean. Those who honored her now despise her. And then this kind of leads to maybe the only hopeful words for the exile in Lamentations. In 3:22-24, it says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. Though we are in exile, we are not going to be consumed because God loves us. And then in chapter 4, it's this vivid picture of a 2-year siege of Jerusalem. And it contrasts the beautiful way Jerusalem used to be to this just heartbreaking reality of what it is in exile now. And so then in chapter 5, it ends with Israel just begging God not to ignore their suffering. And so the author kind of offers this, paradox, if you will, where he says, God, you are king and you are sovereign, but yet in the midst of exile, I feel like you're nowhere to be found. So it's just a very honest picture of the reality of the emotions and looking on to this state of exile. And so then in Daniel, we see Israel's a minority surrounded by a new culture and new gods. And some revolt and some gave in. But this is where we see the input of the prophet Jeremiah. He said to settle in, again, build a life of your own and seek the well-being of Babylon. It's not compromise, but it's also not revolt. And this gives a portrait of some of the elites who were high up in the Babylonian government. And they would even dress and talk and live like Babylonians and take on their names in certain ways. But when faced in the midst of compromising their faith, they choose faithfulness to Yahweh and they resist Babylonian influence. And we see this when Daniel and his friends are pressured to bow down to the golden image in chapter 3 and then in chapter 1, where they are refusing to eat foods that would defile their body. So the way of exile combines loyalty and subversion. And then in Ezra and Nehemiah, 50 years post-exile, this tells the return of some of the Israelites to Jerusalem and what happens when they rebuild the city and start their lives. So in Ezra 1:2, we see Cyrus makes this decree, they can go back out to Jerusalem. And so this fulfills a promise made in chapter 25, and this should trigger our hopes of prophetic promises. But when Ezra comes back, he finds that a lot of these exiles have made foreign marriages. And this is the real state of exile. And then in Ezra 7, or you see that in Ezra 9. And then Nehemiah wants to go back and help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But he's too faced with this opposition of these people coming in and wanting to help build the walls. And this is interesting because there's this tension, because Zechariah said that the New Jerusalem would be a city without walls and that everyone could come in and the Spirit of God was going to be there. But in Nehemiah 4, he operates in a very different way. And he says that the people coming in can have no part of his vision. Again, emphasizing this is the true state of exile. Things just are not complete. And then in 8-12, we see Ezra and Nehemiah join together, and this is this moment of hope, and we see these 7 days of Torah readings and the celebration of the Feast of Booths and this covenantal renewal. And it looks great, right? But they aren't out of exile, even though we think they could be, and it just doesn't last. Because in chapter 13, Nehemiah finds that the people are still living as if they're in exile. The temple is neglected and the Torah is being violated. And Israel's so close, but they aren't following the Torah, and they're back in the way of exile. And though they are back in the promised land and they're not physical exiles, they're definitely spiritual exiles. And what God's people really need is just this holistic transformation of the heart if they're going to obey God. So the biblical prophets see Israel continually worshiping foreign gods, and they kept acting in the same corrupt ways as their ancestors. Then the prophets are saying the exile isn't over. And Israel's Babylonian exile is this universal image. It's the feeling that there's something missing. And so exile is the human condition of the Bible. And we see this repetition of human corruption and this metaphorical Babylon that we can't get out of. And yet this transfers into the New Testament, and Israel, we see, has held out this hope that one day the Messiah would come and would fill this gap of exile. And this is where the big piece of the puzzle comes in with Jesus of Nazareth. And this is the theme of exile running through the whole Bible. And Jesus provides this pivotal point in how this theme progresses. So Jesus wanders around without a home, and he gives hope of restoration of a home that all humanity is really looking for. And even the Bible Project says that Jesus cared about people that didn't have homes. And even half a millennium later, Jesus is still using language of the exile. And we see this in Mark 1:4-45, where Jesus approaches and heals a leper. And then in Luke 19, when he brings in the outcast and the tax collector, and it says the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And then Jesus also points out that people live in an exile that we create. And he shows that the true way home is by service and humility. It's lowering ourselves and caring about justice and caring about the oppressed. Claiming he is the way, his life and his love are more powerful than our sin and our state of exile that we're in. So as Jesus's followers committed their lives to him, there's a new way of living in exile. We are now sojourners and citizens of heaven, but yet we're still exiles as we're here on earth. So there's this fundamental idea that the biblical authors are pointing out, that everyone's story is really a story of exile, but with a new complete picture of how to live as Jesus brings us in the New Testament. We wait for the day when Jesus comes back to transform this earth into the New Jerusalem and fully wipe away the state of exile.